Again, a big thanks to the guys from Mercedes here in the U.S. for giving me a hand with some technical data and some pictures for this presentation. All right, so what about the Mercedes 722.9? Well, this is the 5th generation of automatic transmission that obviously Mercedes has ran. You guys have access to these transmissions. You've had access to them for a considerable number of years now in Australia and New Zealand. This is a fully electronically controlled gearbox. Most of the guys here in the U.S. are very apprehensive about getting into one because of issues that they've heard with the controllers and controller programming. Now, that's something we're going to talk about. You need to probably get yourself a pen and a piece of paper because I'm going to give you a web address that you're definitely going to be interested in if you're not already dealing with these folks. Mercedes is pretty well tight-lipped when it comes to trying to work with the aftermarket, especially on the reprogramming side, even though legislation-wise they're forced legally into providing calibration information for the aftermarket. The calibration information they provide is very, very expensive. And so a lot of guys have been really apprehensive to even jump into these 722.9s because of that. The other thing is that you need to be aware of is that the units that you get, in other words, when you get a new Mercedes transmission or a rebuilt Mercedes transmission, or you get a what they call a plate assembly, which basically is the valve body and the TCM. That valve body and TCM will not just fit in any vehicle. You have to erase the information that's in its memory. You then have to flash new information into its memory called an SCN number and also a CVN number into the memory of the controller. If you don't do that, you will basically have a pull toy on your hands. In other words, this car will not start. So as an example, if you went down to your local salvage yard or a recycling yard and bought a TCM/valve body, in other words, this plate assembly, and you put it in the car, the inhibit will basically, inhibitor system itself will basically inhibit the engine from physically starting. So in other words, when the SCN numbers and the CVN numbers do not match, you're going to end up in a situation, it looks at that VIN code from processor to processor, and it will prevent the car from physically running. So there becomes a necessity to have programming capabilities if you're going to do the 722.9. And that's where what I'm going to give you right now comes into play. If you do not work closely with a Mercedes dealer, so you're out in the middle of the outback someplace, or obviously on the South Island of New Zealand or whatever it happens to be, where you do not have access to a Mercedes dealer that's willing to work with you, there is another alternative for you. There's a company that's called BlueLink. They're located in Durham, North Carolina. Here is their web address. So you're going to want to write this down. It is www.blue.com. So I'll run that over again. www.blue.com. What they do is they have the abilities to remotely program your Mercedes valve bodies right in the vehicle. You can also do engine calibration. Calibration has been a huge issue with Mercedes. They have basically issued calibration after calibration after calibration on these vehicles. There are so many calibrations that you really can't keep track of all the different cals that have been released. So this would be a good resource for you to contact. I'm not saying you have to use them, but bottom line is a good resource for you to be able to contact for technical data when it comes to Mercedes, as well as if you're going to do reprogramming because you want to install a new valve body / TCM in your vehicle, or you're going to install a different transmission in the vehicle, because they can actually flash this thing remotely. So you can get a set of cables from them, a programming disk from them, a download, and then they can physically then go in and reprogram this thing, put the SCN numbers in and the CVN numbers in for you, and your car will start, operate correctly, and it'll have the latest and greatest calibrations that Mercedes has. Now, one of the kickers on Mercedes calibrations you need to be aware of is the fact that they don't really do it like GM or Ford does it. They don't tell you what the calibration is, nor do they tell you why the calibration was changed. Very little information comes out of Mercedes on that. They simply issue a new calibration number. So you'd have a new calibration ID for that particular VIN code. So what's that mean to me in simple terms again? That means if I do not see that I've got a calibration number in my car that is the latest and greatest, you may want to consider updating the calibration, which again, these folks can help you with that. You can also do it yourself if you want. I mean, you can buy the J2534 stuff and contact Mercedes and get the download from them. But the difference is going to be, guys, is that you're going to have a locksmith certification if you're going to deal with Mercedes on this issue. They will not issue recals for anybody that's not locksmith certified. And the reason for that is because of the fact that their vehicle inhibit system, their vehicle security system itself, is connected in with the transmission controller. So they basically want to make sure that you're a legitimate person out there, and the only way they can do that is if you've been locksmith certified. Well, if you go through a third party who is already certified from Mercedes for this, then you don't have to jump through those hoops. You simply hook it up, they remotely load the software, and literally off to the races you go. Now, one of the other things I should mention to you guys, just so everybody's aware, there's been 3 different versions of controllers with these 722.9s. And again, this is not in your handout. You have the first version, which came out in basically April of 2004. It ran until December of 2005. That was the generation 1, or version 1 they called it. The version 2s came out in December of 2005, and they ran until they got up to basically March of 2010. At that point, it became the Gen 3 version, or version 3 of that plate assembly, in other words, the controller. So the calibration processes are a little bit different. The calibration you're going to load is going to be based off of which controller you have and which VIN code you actually have on your car. So just a little bit of tidbit of information for you up front on the big problem that everybody faces with the Mercedes applications. One is getting access and being able to buy the plate assembly, which is the valve body and TCM as an assembly. You can get those from Mercedes. They've got them on parts restriction right now because they've had so many of them replaced where they've had NTS or no trouble founds with them, that they make you jump through a bunch of hoops to make sure that the unit actually needs to be replaced. If you're having troubles, you're going to want to try a different Mercedes dealer to see if you can purchase it as a parts purchase directly from that Mercedes dealer. Some dealers are really apprehensive to sell it to the aftermarket, even though they're required by mandate to obviously sell that product. The other thing is you can buy them aftermarket. There are several aftermarket companies now that have bought bulk supplies of these Mercedes units themselves, and they sell controllers. So you can go a couple different ways. You'll have to do a little bit of research on the thing, but again, these guys at BlueLink will be a pretty good resource for you. Now on the scan tool portion of it, just so everybody's aware, again, you guys got an awful lot of experience down in Australia and New Zealand with this unit as compared to those of us in the United States. In the U.S., we have very little support scan tool-wise for this particular transmission. I'm assuming you guys have a lot better support than what we do. If you do not have good support for these systems, then again, BlueLink would be a source because it comes with your programming kit that you get from them. You get basically scan tool capabilities with your laptop. So you can obviously look at scan data, you can clear codes, you can do all sorts of different stuff with it per se. A couple things like the shift position sensor and so forth. So again, you get that as part of their package that they've got. You can also look at some of the European scan tools that are out there. There are several European scan tools that work very well on these Mercedes. So you may want to get a hold of some of your friends in the European market itself and see what they're actually using and what they've had good success with. Again, so Bottom line is, this is really where guys get apprehensive about working on the 722.9 is because of this software lockup, because of the vehicle security system issues, and actual scan data, getting hold of the scan data for the vehicle and finding enough scan data to help you diagnose the vehicle. So those are a couple solutions for you. You don't necessarily have to use them, but just simply a couple ideas that you may want to try. All right, so back to our presentation here. As we just talked about, the control module is integrated into the valve body assembly. They call it a plate assembly. Again, we're going to have some different terminology as we go through this because obviously the Europeans deal with things different than Americans or Australians do or New Zealanders do. Torque converter operates in open mode basically all the time, so you're going to have slip in all 7 forward speeds. You're going to have gear ratios achieved, as you can see, with 4 brakes and 3 mobile disc clutches. Got 3 planetaries on the inside of the unit, so again, not much different from some of the other transmissions that you've dealt with in the years past. As far as advantages, the big reason for going to this was fuel economy. That was the whole idea behind it. So as you can see, fuel economy went up, noise levels of the engine and so forth went down. This transmission has been around for quite some time. As you can see, it was introduced in 04. M-Class, R-Class, G-Class, CLS, E350, all those transmissions receive, or all those vehicles receive the 722.9. So this transmission has been around for a while. It's going to be around for a while. There are some that are shift-by-wire systems, some that aren't. So the shift-by-wire ones means you're going to have a positioning sensor on the inside of the transmission to help you with that. We have 2 different terminologies that they deal with this transmission. So when you're talking to a parts guy about a 722.9, it's not uncommon for him to talk about it in terms of either NAG2 or 7G-tronic. So the 722.9 is also known as a NAG2 or a 7G-tronic. This is where it gets a little bit strange. See popping up on your screen right now. This transmission has 2 reverse modes. It is controlled by the button that you have for sport mode and comfort mode. So depending on which mode you put the transmission in determines which gear ratio you actually have the transmission obviously operate in for reverse. The other thing that's kind of strange is many times this does not start in first gear. Most instances the transmission will actually start in second gear and upshift from there. So there are some times it does. A good example of a time that it would be is when the engine is cold. They do that specifically for catalytic converter warm-up or different driving situations you're in with your foot on the throttle and so forth. They will start the car in first gear, but normally it does not physically start in first gear on most of these 722.9s. The transmission fluid that you've got is a new fluid from Mercedes. It's called ATF 3353. It's very similar to Dexron 6 transmission fluid. Mercedes is pretty insistent upon you using their fluid. It's very expensive, but again, I would highly recommend you do use their fluid. It is made by Shell and Fuchs, and of course I know that your markets, Shell is huge down in Australia and New Zealand, so I'm assuming you probably are going to have pretty good access to getting this outside of Mercedes themselves. Mercedes part number I'm listing for you here. This transmission itself, the 0.9 can use it, and it will back service, as you can see, all the way down to the 722.3 transmission. When it comes to checking your fluid level, you're going to find you typically don't have a dipstick. So this is kind of like a 6L80 that didn't have a dipstick. They have a standpipe on the inside of the oil pan itself where you actually check your fluid level. So that means that fluid temperature becomes crucial when it comes to checking fluid level. Well, that fluid temperature is going to be based on which pan you have on this transmission. There are 2 different pans for it. There's a deep pan and a shallow pan, and the height of that standpipe is different in those 2 pans. So bottom line is you need to check the fluid temperature prior to checking your fluid level. Picture, as you can see, is showing you a tool hooked up to this. Very similar to what they do with the 6L80s that have a standpipe in them. You hook up a tool to it and actually force the oil into the transmission itself if the transmission is underfilled. Now, obviously, you're not going to spend $10,000 on a a fill machine, lot of containers like those quart can containers, and they simply adapt them with whatever adapters they need to make this thing physically work. So just another source for you as far as how you actually adjust the fluid level. Here's a look at the two pans we're going to talk about. The pan difference, as you can see, pan depth difference is 3 millimeters. Overall pipe is 13.5 millimeters difference. So bottom line is make sure that you know which pan you have, because it's going to determine what temperature you actually have to look at the fluid at in order to check the fluid level. And I'll be showing you that here a little bit later. This is a look at the major components for this transmission. Very similar to the 722.6 unit itself. You got a multiple disc clutch in the torque converter. See the little protrusion sticking out the front of the torque converter itself. Then you have some just basic components, clutches and planetaries and pumps and all that neat stuff. The valve body is really where the rubber meets the road. That's really what's different about it compared to other transmissions, and we'll be getting into the valve body here in a minute. The picture that corresponds with this picture of the transmission itself, or I should say the page that corresponds, is a component list. Now, Mercedes calls things out as K's for clutches and B's for brakes, even though they are both clutches. That's because they refer to them in German technology or German terminology. So K, the word for clutch starts with K in German. The word for brake starts with B in German. So bottom line is we just kind of have to get used to using their terminology. The one thing I might bring to your attention is down here on number 19 and number 20 on that list. We're talking about a ring magnet for the speed sensors. The ring magnet is actually built into the housings of the transmission itself. So if the ring magnet decides to go on vacation permanently for you, you're going to have to replace the housing, because you can't just pull the ring magnet out and replace it. It is basically glued into the housing itself, and I'll be showing you a picture of that here in a minute. TCC operation of this transmission, as I told you, you got converter clutch operation in all forward gears, and it's going to base that converter operation on your engine torque and also your output shaft speed. So that's what this chart on the right-hand side is about. So the area in blue is showing you when the converter is in the open state. In other words, obviously, when you're at such and such output shaft speed below 345 RPM, the converter is in the open state. As you raise the output RPM and raise the throttle level, then we're going to start bringing the converter clutch in. So this converter clutch itself will be coming on at very low road speeds to try to pick the fuel economy up, and it effectively never is fully locked. So it's constantly slipping at no matter what road speed you're actually at. It does have a high temp override. We used to call that super hot mode. If the lockup clutch itself, for some reason the transmission is overheating, we're monitoring the transmission fluid temperature, which is part of the plate assembly, that TCM/valve body assembly. It's got built into it. If you get above 140 C, it sets a P2226 trouble code and defaults this transmission by kicking off the torque converter clutch and forcing it to the next lower gear. The whole theory there is very similar to what we did in super hot mode with the GM stuff. We basically spin the motor a little bit faster to try to increase your oil volume through your cooler. The transmission converter housing is a die-cast aluminum housing. The transmission housing itself is actually made of magnesium. So that means you're going to have specialized bolts that they use. You don't just use any old bolt that you found laying around the workbench. So these bolts all have coatings on them. And they're also torque to yield type bolts. That's the reason it says no power tools on there, because they're very afraid of you damaging the threads, because of course the magnesium is extremely soft and you can end up pulling threads out of this thing without too much effort. So they're going to have not only torque numbers that you got to hit, but also angle numbers after you get to a certain specific torque. So they're a torque to yield style bolt. The bell housing gasket itself, you can see the difference here between the aluminum bell housing and the magnesium case there. That's the differences in colors that you see. There's a gasket that sets between those. It's a stamp type gasket, very similar to what you'd see on some of the other transmissions that are out there. It is a reusable gasket. Again, that gasket itself is going to have a lip on it. That lip, as you can see, is facing towards the front of the transmission housing itself. And its job is to channel any water that gets there away from the transmission case. Because again, one of the things they're very concerned about is saltwater corrosion of the magnesium. So we ran into that in GM when we were doing transfer cases. We had a lot of magnesium transfer cases out there, and they would corrode something horrible when we get on salty roads. Now again, I realize you guys don't have that issue, but you certainly have the issue of being around salt water. Oil cooler lines on this transmission, as you can see, is a plug-in style line, not like some of the other transmissions where you got a screw-in style fitting. So you're going to end up with a simple clamp that goes over top here, some O-rings, obviously, to seal that line up. Oil pump, nothing different here than you've dealt with other transmissions for decades. You got a gear and crescent style oil pump. The notch I'm pointing to there in blue is simply there to reduce intake noise from the pump itself. When it comes to the apply components, as you can see, the apply components that are brakes, we're saying of the brakes that you've got, as you can see, there are 4 different brakes. You're going to have B1 and B3 that are single-sided plates. When you come to the clutches themselves, you can see we've got K1, K2, K3 in this picture. They're all single-sided plates. So a K clutch is going to be a driving clutch. A B clutch is going to be a holding clutch. This is a look at the clutch apply chart, and I want to bring your attention to basically a couple things on here. First thing I want you guys to look at is the 6th and 7th gear. Notice this is overdriven in both 6th gear and 7th gear. So you have 2 overdrives, very similar to a lot of the 6-speeds that are on the market. The second thing I want to bring your attention to is the reverse position. Notice there are 2 different gear ratios. That's based on what position you put the comfort/sport switch into. That will determine whether you are going to get a 3.41 or a 2.23 ratio for reverse. The third thing I want to bring your attention to is that this transmission, like some other transmissions, turn clutches on in neutral. So the first transmission I ever ran into is way back when, 4T40s, or excuse me, not 4T40s, 440 T4s. Your 440 T4 transmission, which later then became the 4T60, 4T60E transmission, we turned the input clutch on that transmission when you were in park and neutral. And the reason behind that was to keep you from having a delay going into gear, because we needed the input clutch on in order to move the car forward or backward. Well, if you look at this chart, you look at the neutral range. So I'm the third one from the bottom right here. Notice the B3 clutch is on and the K3 clutch is on. Well, if you trace those up, they're going to be on in first and in reverse also. So rather than end up with a delay from taking excessive fill time to fill those clutches, they simply turn the clutches on. Now, what's this mean to me in simple terms again? That means if for some reason that another clutch is dragging, so let's say the B2 clutch is dragging, this thing's going to want to try and move forward on you even though the car is in neutral, because those other 2 clutches are on solid. So again, it can create a little bit of a problem that you're not used to dealing with some other transmissions that actually turn everything off when you're in neutral range. One of the other features that this transmission has is just like the 6L80 has, it can skip shifts. We can skip up shifts, we can skip down shifts. So this is just a chart to show you how it actually does that. So if we were skipping from 7th to 5th gear, it would release the B3 clutch, apply the K1 clutch. We're skipping from 6th gear to 2nd gear, we're going to obviously release the K2 clutch, apply the B2 clutch. So depending on which gears it's actually trying to shift, or I should say skip, will determine which clutches it's going to apply and which clutches it's actually going to release. So just be aware that this thing does not necessarily shift 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It can skip all over based on what engine load and output shaft speed actually are. So if it thinks that it would best off skip a shift, it's going to do that on you. So again, don't condemn the transmission because of the skip shift feature. All right, this is where the rubber meets the road on this transmission, is right here on this picture popping up. This is this plate assembly, as Mercedes calls it. We would call that, and GM would call it a TECM, which basically is nothing more than the valve body and the electronics that are attached to the valve body. Again, there's going to be some big things you need to know about this. First thing you need to know, you cannot just simply pull that assembly out of another transmission and stick it in your Mercedes that you have in your workshop. The reason you can't do that is because when it looks at that VIN and the CVN and SCN numbers, they don't match. And so the theft deterrent goes into action and it basically locks the theft deterrent, locks the vehicle out where the vehicle will not start. So really bad, obviously, news for you. So bottom line is we have to erase that information and reload the correct information. So you're either going to need to be able to get hooked up with a Mercedes dealer so that you can do this type of operation if you're going to want to service these transmissions, or you're going to have to want to do it yourself, which you can, okay? Or you're going to have to hook up with somebody, obviously that's a third-party source, like these guys here at BlueLink. So again, you're going to have to address this if you're going to be in this particular business. And this is what's held guys out of working on the 722.9 is this one thing right here. There's been a lot of guys getting locked out and then towing it to the Mercedes dealer, and so it's been a real bad taste in their mouth. This is a look at this whole valve body slash TCM solenoid pack assembly as one picture. Now, one of the things that Mercedes does is they call things out differently than we do. They use their engineering terms. So if you look at the solenoids coming across top, that first solenoid says it's a Y38Y6, the second one's a Y38Y3, the third one's a Y38Y1, the fourth one's a Y38Y8. They don't mean to confuse you there. They're actually using their engineering terminology for everything. We got a chart that delineates and obviously compares those different terminologies and puts them into something that you can actually read. So if we're looking at that Y38Y6, you go down to the chart, that's a B2 clutch solenoid. The Y38Y3, that's going to be a K2 clutch solenoid. So that tells you, that chart will interpret it for you. The devices you see there in red, those are your speed sensors. So a Y38N3 and a Y38N2 and a Y38N1, those are your three different speed sensors you're going to have. Those little blue round things that are in that valve body assembly or in that TECM assembly, those are floats, and they basically control the oil level in this transmission to prevent, obviously, oil from getting trapped up into the planetaries. So if you're aggressively driving this vehicle, which a lot of people do aggressively drive the Mercedes, especially the sports car versions, what it boils down to is they don't want a bunch of oil aeration issues. So those floats control whether you're going to allow the oil to get up into that planetary or not. Last but not least thing that you see right there in yellow, that is the TCM in this transmission. So that big yellow thing basically between the solenoids, that's the TCM. The little yellow thing, it looks like a T almost, or an L I guess you'd say, that is your Prindle switch. In other words, that's going to be your switch for your range position. And that will have to be learned just like you learn the adapts. You actually have to go through a process. So you've got to have scan capabilities in order to learn this thing. So if you bought a plate assembly from Mercedes or some other source, not only do you have to load the calibrations, not only do you have to relearn the adapts, but you also have to relearn the range sensor. One of the reasons Mercedes is so much of a stickler on this is they hydraulically flow check all of the solenoids, and then they build an algorithm for that solenoid block. So there's a baseline set of pressure curves that are stored basically within that software of that particular unit itself. So there's no interchange as far as solenoids are concerned. So if you pull a solenoid out, you need to make sure you put it back in the same spot. Bottom line is this is the reason Mercedes has got such a hiccup problem here when it comes to calibrations. This and, of course, the theft deterrent. The TCM is, of course, the center of the electronic operation of this transmission, just like it has been before. It is flashable. And again, you can choose how you want to do this, whether you want to do it obviously on your own, you want to take it to a Mercedes dealer, or you want to use a third party. It's kind of up to you. But you will have to address this as an issue. There is no way to get around flashing these controllers. You cannot interchange pieces. Now, one of the questions that came up on the last webinar was, what if I simply rebuild the transmission? Do I got to reflash it? No, you do not. But there has been so many calibration updates in the transmission that effectively you're going to want to at least check the calibration to make sure you're the latest and greatest, because very good chance you're going to find out you are not, and you're going to want to do the update. This is what the TCM wiring looks like. So as you can see here, we got our wiring connector. Pin 1 is CAN high, and of course pin 2 is CAN low. So we're using a CAN data bus here. Pin 3 is your diagnostic connector. They do have a diagnostic connector on these transmissions. Pin 4 is circuit 87, and pin 5 is circuit 31. What I want to point out to everybody is, if you notice, there are no pins, solenoids, or temperature sensors, or anything like that. You have to access your information via scan tool. So just like you would on a GM, there's very little you can do externally to the transmission itself. You can check for power, you can check for ground, and then you got to hook a scan tool to the car. They are having some troubles with fluid protrusion out of this connector itself, so just be aware that you can end up with some pretty bizarre problems, kind of like 4L80E would give you, with obviously ending up with fluid contamination in the connector itself. So they've redesigned the connectors on these cars. In fact, they got a bulletin out, Mercedes does, on updating connectors. So again, if you're running into really crazy stuff that you can't figure out, you may want to look at the connector, make sure there's no particulate and, of course, fluid inside the connector itself. TCM communication. Again, most everything that the TCM is going to deal with is be done over the CAN data bus. Very little is done inside the transmission. So your speed sensors, your rain sensor, and your temperature sensor are the only things that are direct inputs to the TCM. Everything else comes over the data bus. It means your communication system's got to be functional before the transmission is going to physically work right. And that also means you have to have the abilities to this vehicle and get detailed scan information if you want to do repairs on it. So this shows us those inputs and outputs. So everything there on the left-hand side of the screen, the 3 speed sensors and your rain sensor, are showing as an input into the controller. And everything on the right-hand side, which is your cell edge, your diagnostic connector, are shown as the output for this transmission. The sensors are a little different than we've dealt with in the past. They are a Hall effect style sensor, and of course they set right down in that plate assembly. But the trigger for that Hall effect sensor is a magnet that sits inside the drum. So that's what we're showing you there is the number 1 item there in blue. Lower left-hand corner, you will see a picture of the magnet. So we're just having a magnet with alternating north and south poles, which of course causes the Hall effect sensor to trigger into a simple square wave. So bottom line, guys, is you're going to get a square wave output just like you would any other Hall effect sensor. So nothing razzle-dazzle here. The only difference would be is if you had a problem with this, just be the sensor. You could replace the sensor and still have a problem because this magnet is what triggers the sensor. And if the magnet's bad, you're repulsing the assembly. This is a nice Mercedes picture here of what these sensors actually look like. This ring magnet actually looks like inside the drums. I've drawn the red arrows to them, so that shows you the 2 different ring magnets. Again, if we have a problem with ring magnet, we damage one, let's say on overhaul or it goes bad or whatever it happens to be, you have to buy that drum that contains that ring magnet. Your output speed sensor is at the back of the transmission case, as you can see, running off of your park pawl gear. Again, nothing different than you dealt with before. Still a Hall effect style sensor. Range sensor, very similar to range sensors on other vehicles. Very similar to what you'd have, obviously, on a 6L80 again, a binary code sensor, direct input to the TCM itself. Here's the difference. You have if you replace that assembly. So my point is, this is serviced as part of the plate assembly. You cannot buy this range sensor separately. It is all hardwired in, as we're trying to show you in this picture right here. If you fail to learn it, then you're going to end up with this thing going into limp home. So bottom line is, it has to be learned. You have to make sure the SCN numbers and CVN numbers are installed first so that it knows that it's supposed to learn it. Then you have to go into a learn mode for this, and basically it learns position of that sensor. Fluid levels are controlled, as you can see here, by these floats. So the floats basically into the planetaries, so they allow anything that's in the planetaries to drain out. So again, nothing razzle-dazzle about them, simply some floats that float up and down with the oil level in the pan itself. Here's a look at our solenoids. Now you're going to see 4 normally open solenoids and 4 normally closed solenoids. So this first picture, I'm showing you in this instance normally closed solenoids. If you look at where the blue arrows go, those are the solenoids I'm trying to point to at. Obviously, that are normally closed solenoids. That's our K1 clutch solenoid, our B2 brake solenoid, our B3 brake solenoid, and our torque converter clutch solenoid. Those 4 solenoids are all what they consider normally closed. So if we increase pressure, you have to increase current. So if you have no current, you will have no pressure. That's how that solenoid works. The other way the solenoid is arranged is backwards of that. So here we're showing you a picture of the 4 normally open solenoids. When you increase current on these solenoids, so when you in turn increase your current, you'll actually increase your pressure. So here we're looking at a line pressure solenoid, a K2 clutch solenoid, K3 clutch solenoid, and of course a B1 brake valve. So there you go. That's what we've got as far as solenoid layouts. On the diagnostic side of the coin, as you can see there, we've got several different portions of the diagnostics that you're going to be concerned with. One is going to be the oil level check. We're going to take a look at oil level checking and what temperatures you got to look at. Limp home modes, I'm going to give you all the different limp home modes for this transmission. DTCs, there's a ton of DTCs available, over 100 DTCs. And of course, what do you do if you have to replace the transmission or the control module? You've got to access the SCNs and the CVN coding so that you can get this thing to physically start and operate. Here's my fluid level. The big thing you need to know about fluid level is going to vary depending on the pan. So your capacity is going to vary depending on the pan, and the temperature that you're supposed to have is going to be determined by your actual pan that you've got on the vehicle. So as you can see, the level check before you pull the plug out is going to be dependent upon what temperature you actually have this transmission at. Limp home modes. You can see there's several different limp home modes here. Most common one is 6th gear. Sometimes you'll also get it where it has 6th gear, you pull up to a stop, and it ends up being 2nd gear down the road. So again, different limp home modes depending on what actually happened to the vehicle. On the DTCs themselves, as I told you earlier, you got 100 different DTCs, but the controller is only capable of storing 16 DTCs. That's all it can store. So it prioritizes the DTCs and stores only the DTCs that in turn are the priority. So you may end up in a situation where you go through and clear some codes, and now some more codes come back. So that is a possibility with this transmission. And this is probably the biggest thing we're going to talk about here today, is this programming. As I told you guys earlier, this is really what intimidates guys, is this right here. Because you have to reprogram this thing anytime any of this criteria is met. In other words, you're replacing the transmission, you're replacing the valve body / electronic unit, in other words, what they call their plate assembly. You're updating the control module to resolve a software issue. Anytime you do anything like that, you have to reprogram it. If you fail to do that, this car is not going to want to run on you. So here's what we're calling out as something called a marrying the module to the car. What I mean by that is Mercedes actually doesn't call it programming. What they're calling it is marrying it. They are basically hooking that module software-wise to the rest of the vehicle, where everybody's hooked together. So when the communication occurs from module to module, they obviously recognize that everybody's supposed to be hooked together. So if, for example, you went out to a salvage yard and you got a old 722.9 valve body / TCM, in other words, the plate assembly, and you put it on the one in your shop, it's not going to run. So you have to make sure you have the capabilities of doing that. That means you've got to have the abilities to put in what they call the SCN, which is your calibration numbers, and you've got to be able to put the CVNs in. So that basically means that you have to have the abilities to do pass-through programming, which is what we're showing you in this picture. I've got Mercedes tool, as you can see in the picture. Doesn't mean you have to have Mercedes tools. They are J2534 compatible. But again, you're going to have to choose whether you want to do it yourself. If you do, in order to get access to their website, you have to be registered as a certified locksmith because of the security features that you're putting into this thing, or you're going to have to take it to a Mercedes dealer to get this done, or you're going to have to hook up to a third-party source to get this calibration stuff done. And again, they have the capabilities of actually programming it right over the internet for you. So bottom line, guys, is you can get this done even though you guys are living in Australia and New Zealand. Somebody here in the continental U.S. can actually load the calibrations for you. So I would encourage people to get a hold of all these different sources and see what can be done for your particular application in your particular city. So again, you got to be able to load the SCN, which is software calibration number, and you're going to obviously have to make sure the CVNs are also loaded along with that. Again, if you don't get these codes in, if they're not correctly installed, or you forget to install it, you're going to find out the engine's not going to want to run because the theft deterrent system is going to prevent that from happening.